Thank you once again for joining us with Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Keep sending in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating history of the city of Mississauga together here each and every week on Ask a Historian. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. This is part 2 of our interview with Pardeep Singh Nagra, the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, which is located in Malton, right here in Mississauga. If you missed it, last week we explored part 1 of this interview with Pardeep, and so please stay tuned for part 2 of our fascinating talk and visit with Pardeep Singh Nagra of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada.
One of the most decorated soldiers in World War I for Canada was William Barker.
Yep.
Victoria Cross winner.
Yes.
Commanded a number of people, including, for example, Lester B. Pearson, who served in the Royal Flying Corps.
Yep.
We have a book at the museum called A Little Work, A Little Play. And it's the autobiography of the very first Sikh to fly during World War I. The foreword to his book is written by a so-called old and valued dear friend who, when they both served in the RAF, I think that it was defined at that time,
yep,
and found themselves as students together at Oxford and just hung out and loved sports, although they had different sports, love of different sports, from cricket to hockey and all the rest, and you can understand the nuances of that. And who was this gentleman that wrote the book, wrote the foreword? Lester B. Pearson. Right? And we here in Mississauga have the airport, Lester B. Pearson Airport, right here.
Right. Guess
what? Right in my hometown of Malton is a street named what? Churchill.
Yep.
Right? Right? I lived on Victory Crescent in Malton.
Did you? Okay. Yep. All right.
V for Victory. Right? Of Ferdinand Frosch, the marshal, who was speaking at the Battle of Nouvelle-Chapelle, and spoke and looked and said, "Go back to your distant sun-bathed lands and tell all your countrymen how their blood soaked the fields here." Right? And they'll never be forgotten. And that they showed the first steps. They led the first steps to victory. That's right. Where that piece in the quote comes from behind me. Where is that stuff in history? Where is that reality? Right?
We haven't been true to the promise. We have forgotten, right? This is the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things you said earlier, and it triggered just I'm wondering if you can forgive me for wandering down perhaps a different path for a moment, but 1907, the Sikhs in Canada are disenfranchised, which tells me at that point there is a sizable population to be disenfranchised, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So what is kind of that bigger picture of Sikh immigration to Canada? Because we're obviously not talking just about the war years, but there's an earlier history here where there's a societal foundation that's created here in Canada.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So and you're gonna be fascinated by some of the stuff because they're just different touch points. Because as much as we talk about so-called Sikh settlement history in Canada, right? Because we're here as settlers and recognize that when I'm sharing the story of even Sikhs in Canada, where I'm sharing it through a sense of reconciliation and understanding that we're settlers here, and that our story is on settler lands itself. You know, we take that connection history way back to even Charles Metcalfe, right? For which Metcalfe, Ontario, towards Ottawa, is named after. Metcalfe Avenue, right in front of Parliament, is named after, who was serving us with the British, right? And in British India that time, and signs the Treaty of Lahore, which was part of the Sikh kingdom at that time in the early 1800s. Marries a Sikh lady from the Sikh court.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Right? And when you're talking about battles and you're talking about military battles, there's 2 Anglo-Sikh wars.
Okay.
And if we want to really get scary, Matthew, well, then let's keep going on this, because guess what? Can you remind me what region the city of Mississauga is in?
Peel.
Peel. Now, do you know who Peel is named after?
Yes, the British politician of the same surname.
Same name and ilk there, right?
Yep.
Sir Robert Peel.
Yep.
where the police officers in England used to be known as peelers because they were peelers,
Yep.
right? And then there was another nickname because the short form for Robert is Bob. And so
Okay.
that's where the term Bobbies come
Bobbies
from, right?
came from, yep.
Right,
Yep.
right. So you get all these connections, but guess what? If you want to know one of the biggest impacts on Sikh history of why there's no Sikh kingdom right now, there's no Sikh sovereign state in the world right now for Sikhs,
Okay.
it's because of Peel. He was the British Prime Minister and started the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the two Anglo-Sikh Wars, starting in 1845, to get rid of the Sikhs, because the last and most important landmass in what you call India and Pakistan today was the Northwest frontier, because that was the only landmass, the Khyber Pass and everything, into that area geographically.
Okay.
The Northwest Passage, right? The Silk Road, all that aspect. And that was the area that the Sikhs had their kingdom, right from the border literally of Afghanistan, just for lack of a better word, west of Delhi was where the Sikh kingdom was.
Sure.
And so they wanted this place. And so they annexed the Sikh kingdom. And in fact, it was so brutal, the story, that the young Sikh king was brought back to England and converted to a Christian. And so that tale in of itself. And then you look at even Canada's own military history, and if you look at who were two of the very first 3 Victoria Cross winners for Canada, Herbert Reed and William Hall. William Hall is the very first Black recipient of Victoria Cross in Canada. Well, if you do any research and find out where they served and got their medals, was in British India.
Okay.
And Sikhs fought alongside of them. We have some of the same medals to Sikh soldiers that William Hall received his Victoria Cross for, the mutiny piece, right?
Okay.
And then towns in Ontario get named after that, and we even have a street in Mississauga, Lucknow Avenue, because they received it in the battles of Lucknow in Delhi, which we define today as Delhi, Ontario, which is actually Delhi, Ontario, and Lucknow, Ontario, right? So you see all these layers of where some of that history intersects as part of it. You look at Sir John A. Macdonald just finishing signing the B&A Act, and then coming from England, writing to a fellow colleague and friend, because the geopolitics of that time was, he's sure war is going to come one day between England and the US, right?
Right.
And Canada can do a yeoman's of service, right? In trying to figure this out, right? But wanting so-called India to send an army of Sikhs, right? To hold as collateral, because, around that piece. And so writing of the Sikhs, we have original newspaper articles that even the British were talking about. They'd never been met in military science or bravery on the battlefield as they have with the Sikhs. There's tons of that stuff we have laying here. First point references from newspapers, and then we also have letters, actual handwritten letters, speaking of that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so that's part of that piece. And when again, speaking from the military aspect background, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations, going around the Commonwealth, having a big pomp, bashes all over the place, is where a lot of Sikhs that were serving as part of, for example, the ones that came to Canada were part of the Malay State Guides, right? In 1897, coming around as part of those celebrations. And then just at the turn of the century, because one of the first persons of Sikh heritage and lineage actually came within a military framework. He was aide de camp, and the British headquarters were in Halifax. And so Prince Victor Dalip Singh came as an aide de camp, and he was actually the son of that Sikh king that got converted to a Christian.
Really?
And so he came and stayed in Halifax for 2 years, right? So you get these pockets of contacts and connection, and all still military based, most of these pieces. Right. However, they're finding their ways back as part of the history narrative. But then you talk about this settler, what we call the early settler pioneer aspect in the turn of the century, putting the roots down here. And there was a sizable population. It was predominantly all in Vancouver, because the primary way you traveled from Asia as a whole because there's no planes and stuff, it was by ship. So you came across the Pacific and came along that aspect, and that's where they predominantly settled. And what's fascinating is that disenfranchisement was just only one small variable of the barriers the community faced. Employment, ownership of land, not allowed to bring spouses or children.
Right.
And in fact, here's another interesting military tidbit attached to all this pioneer experience you're asking or talking about. It wasn't literally till 1919, 1920 that officially children and women and spouses were allowed to come to Canada, Sikh women, spouses, and children. And why? Because it was at the Imperial War Cabinet that Board and them were challenged. That how are you having these types of rules and restrictions still in a country where these same people that you're still restricting up to 920 just served with such distinction and valor?
Yeah.
Right? So you're looking at all these layers, right? And in fact, here, geopolitically, one of the challenges that the community, because we originally thought, based on some of the early documents we've seen, that World War II, we literally didn't have anybody serving from the Sikh community, because that was pretty much serving, asking, because in fact, World War II was then a little bit more open, and they were asking for volunteers. And we're saying, you're asking us to serve, and we're not even franchised here.
Right.
Do you not understand what's being asked? And so there was a sentiment in the community to really say, forget this nonsense, right? But we have since found some documents of Sikhs that still ended up serving in World War II as well, right, for Canada.
Right.
And so these were just some parts of the landscape that were functioning and sharing the story. But yet, when you look at that pioneer experience, and in fact, you know, just recently I came across an article on Mr. Johal, and there were many pioneers like him who then the community mobilized internally and said, we're going to create our own infrastructure, right? Run our own lumber mills and sawmills, right? So that the wage disparity can be addressed, for employment opportunities can be addressed. But yet a number of them throughout that Pacific coast, you will still see their legacies from their toil, from their industry, from their service. Equally, just like Chinese on the railway, Sikhs worked on the railways as well.
Okay.
Sikhs worked in the cement quarries, right? Todd Inlet. There's so many different fascinating areas of early Sikh contributions towards nation building. And you know, we when we're at the turn of the Komagata incident, 2014, and it was also start of our war commemoration. You know, you look back and you said, you know, would these individuals dream that a child born in Vancouver then was in Calgary, but was the Minister of Multiculturalism, as Tim Opal was, right? Coming around that time period as we're doing these, that will have members in Parliament, right? You know, afterwards, for which then we even had our Minister of Defense, literally, who was part of a regiment, part of the same militia regiment that on land was keeping the Komagata at bay, right? And so you look at where and how, and even then the trajectory could have even been more if the migration patterns were different earlier, and we didn't have these difficulties of being allowed to come, even if we left and wanted to come back, the difficulties, the hardship the community was facing, because literally we ended up almost at one point prior to 1919 dropping to less than 1,000 here in Canada, from being in the thousands, right? That's how intense the early pioneer settler experience was in Canada. But yet again, if I show you pictures, and we'll be able to show hopefully as part of this presentation, the dignity, the grace, the pride for which they pose for these pictures as Canadians, it's just astonishing. And so I speak to you today on those shoulders of their sacrifice, of their toil.
Well, there's an old saying along the lines of, I've seen farther than most, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants, right?
Yes. Yes.
Now, when were Sikhs re-enfranchised?
1947.
1947.
40 years.
Did the service in the Second World War play that you were mentioning already? Like, how do the women were allowed in the 1920s to come, or
Yeah,
wives were
children,
allowed to
women.
come?
Yeah.
But what the enfranchisement itself, in 1947, did that come about in kind of a
No,
retrospective of no?
no, because the service was, for lack of a better word, done after World War One.
Right.
There was nothing more to try to think that we want, I mean, listen, again, with distinction in World War II as well, right? But to say that for that aspect in of itself, that the war had any effort, in fact, it proved it didn't,
Okay.
right? Because the feet were still being dragged, right? Over 20, literally 27 years after the World War One, right? And so nothing but I mean, there's no way to look and not name and label it what it was: racism and discrimination, period. There's no other justification, because if you want to know, in fact, what might have done it was the geopolitics of it, because that's when India became independent and Pakistan became independent, because there was partition and went right through the Sikh heartland of Punjab. That was the other irony of this piece, that predominantly partition. India itself didn't technically get partition. Punjab got partitioned. Right. When you whole look at the lines and where they're drawn and how they're drawn, and today why the Kashmir issues are still prominent, is because once it hits that, it wraps around, and all of that gets put out towards India as a landmass, right? And this is really literally in the heart of Punjab, because you're talking about Lahore, and now we talk about East and West Punjab, or East and West Lahore, right? Because Lahore used to be the capital of Punjab. Okay. And so a lot of our even history is sitting today in what we call Pakistan, right? And that was all happening in 1947, all around that piece, right? So it's interesting that independence and franchise almost literally came around at the same time. And a great story that Hardik Malik had visited a couple of times. He even spoke at the Empire Club, right? We even had Dr. Sundar Singh speaking at the Empire Club as well.
Okay.
Are great, fascinating places, because those speeches are available online as well for individuals. But in 1947, when India got its independence, Hardik Singh Malik was India's first High Commissioner to Canada. Okay. Right? Yeah. So lots of intersectionalities.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have this. It's a tangled web.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I don't think we've successfully documented yet is a soldier from historic Peel County who served in the war. Although we know that there's these connections. You've referenced these early connections, kind of these hubs and Peel certainly has some connections to early Sikh communities as well. But can you talk about Peel in the larger context of kind of the Sikh story in Canada, of how we fit or connect in a broad sense to the Sikh Canadian experience?
Well, besides some of the early pioneer stories that I've been telling you about and settlement stories, I pretty much laugh, because then I define the rest of Canadian Sikh history through Malton.
Okay. Fair enough, that's allowed.
and I've actually written an article, I think it's called An Ode to Malton, right? Okay. Facetiously enough, and humbly enough, I was even saying my own story. I grew up in Mississauga. I was born in Punjab, came here when I was 3, and literally, we had bought a house in Kittredge in Malton, right? And in those days, you just moved around the neighborhood, right? We moved from Kittredge to Victory to Catalpa and stuff, right? Walking across the street, literally, when I was on Victory, to go and get to the auto show, which used to be at the International Center, right? Being fascinated with McDonnell Douglas and all the aerospace around, and the aero and stuff. And like I said, living on some of these streets around Churchill, Merritt, and Iverson, and all that kind of stuff as it relates. But if you look at that piece, similar to when you look at the migrant patterns, that when they come into or through a hub, they want to be close to the hub that they come into. So in Vancouver, when they arrive literally on the shores of Bernard Inlet area, as the ships are arriving generally around there, they're literally settling right around that area. The very first Sikh Gurdwara in Canada was on 2nd Avenue, right? Literally, just a walk away from Bernard Inlet. You look around here, that, at that time, was at one time named Malton International Airport, then became Toronto International Airport. Today it's Pearson International Airport. That the community wasn't more than 20 kilometers away from the airport at any given time. the very first Gurdwara in Ontario, the Pape Avenue one, right around late 1960s. Over 50 years now, it's been around that settlement. You know, large early settlement community in Mississauga, predominantly Malton, and then other aspects, and then over the years in Peel as a whole. And then you start looking at stories, and you know, I mean, my story outside of being the executive director of the Sikh Canadian Museum, and people might not know, but I was a boxer, right? And Hollywood ended up making a movie about me as well.
I would say this is going to be another episode. We're gonna
and so what's part of that experience of the Sikh community in Mississauga? You have somebody a Hollywood movie was made after. Yeah. Well, who was one of the very first Sikhs to be elected into federal politics? Gurbakh Smalley, right? Where did today's leader of a national party, Jagmeet Singh, start his political career? Malton, yeah. Right? Where did Minister Baines, who's since left politics right now, who was he? What was his riding? Included Malton, right? And when you look through those types of things, you know, sometimes we've been seeing those signs saying the 410, all roads lead to Brampton, right? I start saying all 6 stories come out of Malton, right? Or have some connection back, right? That you could find some anecdotes. I was like, oh no, I knew relatives growing up, or we used to go visit, or yeah, you too, right? Because we, you know, as we continue to spread out and move on and out, that a lot of this all comes back to this area itself, right? You know, we have a strong place of worship. The museum itself is in Malton, Mississauga. Yeah. And we're proud Mississaugans as much as we're proud Ontarians, as much as we're proud Canadians, as much as we are proud Sikhs. Yeah. And giving to the community, being part of the community, engaging with the community, the civic life, and all that are things that we, you know, I don't think embrace enough either as citizens, because you know, too often we've defined things and people as exotic, and I laugh because, you know, and I'll tell you from an anti-oppression lens piece itself of how sometimes our mind thinks about certain things. I remember I was in a presentation and we're just doing intros and I was asking tell us something that is interesting about you, or you know, fascinating, or superpower, or what have you. And I remember somebody talking about, oh, you know, I went to go and visit India, and I think it was for 3 months or 6 months or something like that. And you hear the oohs, ahs, and oh, I'd love to visit, and oh, I want to go there. Oh, you're so lucky, that's so special. And I'm going, are you kidding me? I was born there, and I get discriminated against every single day around here. Being born in that country, I don't get any social capital from it. You go to visit it, and you're getting all the oohs and ahs out of it, right? And why I say that is because in a twisted way, that is here, and we are that as well, right? And so you know, you have an opportunity here, especially in Mississauga, from the diversity that people in the world would literally die for, to have that opportunity from a human perspective, a neighbor perspective, and access to any religious institution, and access to literally authentic foods and stuff, right? Because we're not just talking about generations after where we're all in some industries, but none of them are authentic coming through where you have, you know, some of these pieces. And yet we can't see the humanity and the value in that. Yep. Right? It's almost shame on us. Right?
I agree entirely. I often say that we don't necessarily understand what it is. Take it to home, whether Malton or Mississauga. I don't know how broad you want to go, but yeah, take it home. What's the Mississauga identity? What is somebody from Mississauga? What are they embracing? And think of all those opportunities, that breadth of experience, that breadth of food, of culture, of, you know, like all those kinds of. We have an amazing ability here to connect across the seams culturally and religiously and
then the last bit about that is not forgetting that I'm not about food, song, and dance, and then not just seeing me as a so-called Punjabi, to see me as a Canadian, my son who's never been to this place, that someone's going to say. So my son's walking down the street, is somebody going to identify him as an Indian kid or a Canadian kid? Because he's brown skinned and wears a top knot and sometimes has his head covered, right? right? What is he? Again, it comes back down to that narrative of the soldiers I talked about. If I were to ask a kid to draw a picture of a Canadian, would they draw somebody with a turban? And if they didn't, and if I showed them a picture and saying, this person is Canadian, they said, no, they're not. Then what are they? Right? Because then the question is, do Canadians not wear turbans? Because I would say yes. You know, talking before you is a Canadian right now who's wearing a turban.
Right. Well, you use the term, and it's very powerful to think of it really what you're saying. But early on in our interview, you used the term "people who looked like me," or not seeing images of people who look like me.
Yeah.
And I hope, I mean, I hope it's at a time where we see all face as Canadian identity, of all symbols as Canadian identity.
Well, Matthew, I'm going to be honest. I've never had that problem personally.
Right.
Right. It comes down from an individual level of do I see somebody who identifies as or who presents as Black, a Canadian? I do.
Yeah.
I don't question their presence here. I never have. Somebody wearing a hijab, I don't question their presence or their Canadianness here. Nope. Right. Nope. That's the real crux of it at the end of the day. Right. That I've never had to have that thinking in my mind. Never have. Right. Yep. But I know through some of the learnings or our own lack, because today in 2022, if you learn about the history, but even knowing just a little bit more to know that, yes, there are people who look like me who have been here for over 100 years in this country, families have defined for centuries, right? In terms of how for decades they've been part of the social fabric, right? And will be more surprised when I talk to people, because you see, I don't need to engage that question, where are you from? That's not a social cue that I need to have for anybody I connect with over here, and I ever have connected with. Right. Because my assumption always has been and always will be, they're from here.
Yep.
Okay, and here might be Scarborough, here might be Waterloo, here might be Windsor, here might be from Vancouver, Alberta, I don't know. Yeah. But secondly, I don't care, because where they're from is secondary to, they're here now, they're in front of me, you're with me.
Yeah, so exactly.
It's secondary to you are here. So what does it matter? Right?
It seems to me, it's like, it's such a clear consciousness of way you look at people. And then I'm like, why are we still having conversations around
right? But we have intimate fascination, and then we also always know, because let's be honest again, Matthew. Heaven forbid somebody comes up to me and go, "Where are you from?" And I say, "Malton," right? Yep. And you know what the second parallel question? Oh, where are you really from? Like, I have to be from somewhere else. Like, my son has to be from somewhere else. Like, it's not good enough to just be here, regardless of why they're interested and they're fascinated. Because be fascinated with my over 50 years lived experience here in literally Mississauga.
Yep.
I got enough tales.
Oh, absolutely. And also, you know, thinking of the beginning of our conversation here about service and you know, Sikh soldiers and military conflict, whatever, reading our own histories with the lens that they were not always inclusive either, and that there are gaps within our knowledge, and
yes.
You know, inviting people to kind of explore and fill in those gaps and share those stories. I think that's probably, you know, with your museum as well, the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, you're probably always asking for people to bring their stories to you and make those connections and fill in those gaps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. You know, and like again, you know, it's just phenomenal, because you look at up and coming, and again, you talk about the gaps, and it's not even just the gaps, it's even still today. We have professionals across every single spectrum, right? We even have authors writing children's books. So there's no excuse today for an educational system to say we don't have literature anymore.
Right.
We have authors from Mississauga writing children's books. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. We have speakers, we have experts. There's no reason not to engage, right? And so, absolutely. So I think these things are important, and that these conversations should continue.
Well, and just if we can wrap up on this, and first and foremost say thank you, but secondarily, thank you for the positivity that you share this information with, because I think of these stories, particularly disenfranchisement and the length of time, even just bringing families over and the being turned away from our borders. I mean, this could be a very negative angry filled report. You know what I mean? And that doesn't generate conversation either.
Yeah. We can take a whole different approach.
Yeah.
And yet, like I said, despite, and it's not fortunate that you have to go through those things to get to and have it.
Yeah.
But will tell you, Andrew, in doing the work that I do and professionally, but I'll also accept the other ones, right? Because that's the other problem we have sometimes. Saying, no, don't speak to me unless you're not angry or you're not frustrated. Why shouldn't I be angry? In fact, in 2022, Matthew, if you look at the questions I posed to you, those still have not been answered. My son still will not be called Canadian walking down the street, right? A kid will not put down for a headstone the Sikh script. A child still will not, or a young adult will not identify a turban wearing as a soldier, right? And so I should be frustrated. I should be angry, and that's okay too. Yep. So I don't want to negate for those people who want to present it through that lens, because I think that's just equally as authentic, right? Yep. In fact, I'll be honest with you. It's actually all that anger and frustration that drives me. When you're talking about those books, if you want to talk about why and how this book came to be, is because Steve's daughter goes to school and pulls out a book on either Remembrance Day or the Poppy or Flanders. I think it was actually Flanders. And when Steve seen no reference of anything that looks like us, he just says something has to give, something has to change. Now, it shouldn't be up to us. It should be enough that we have access to resources and that's expertise. But when we also got to become the writers, and we should be able to tell our own stories, but also be the ones who are giving up financially because of these pieces, right? When you're looking at institutions and big publishers saying, why? Because these stories should be important to all Canadians. Right.
Absolutely.
And museums should every single museum should have paid curators from diverse communities as part of their payroll. And anytime an exhibit is coming up, even if it's not on Sikhs, that to have a perspective that I might bring,
it goes through the lens.
A link. Maybe there is something that I find as a link. Right. But it's not until you kind of have those present experiences present as part of the decision making or engagement aspect of it, right? You won't necessarily get it. And so this is why these things have to be changed and shifted, because we still haven't shifted fast enough, right? And in some fields of my work, we say justice delayed is justice denied. Yep. Don't you think my representation as a Canadian is injustice for the lack of it? And so as it continues to not to be present, it's actually my own lived experience justice being denied. It's any delay is being denied, right? And so that's why these are critically important. And if anybody who's watching and listening is asking when we should start, it should have been yesterday, but let's start today at least.
Yes. There shouldn't be an excuse to continue delays that we have enough of a material, just collectively speaking, Canadian consciousness. We have enough material in front of us to say it's time to have those conversations. Like get the head out of the sand.
Absolutely.
It just for me, it's a remarkable story that I know, just even in my own sense, I'm barely scratching the surface of, and the linkages to me are the most fascinating things. Not only the broader stories of Canadian and governmental and those sort of things, but the local linkages. How the community here at home connects to the Mississauga identity, the Malton identity. I mean, I don't think we give Malton enough props in the whole thing.
We know that. That's why I'm going to hold on to it as a distinct town here, Matthew. There's not too many people. I mean, I know people say Streetsville and Cooksville and Lauren Bar, stuff like that, right? But Malton, we almost have a distinct identity. And when I'm talking about identity, I'm not talking about like ethnic identity stuff like that. I'm just talking about as a town, right? Because we're almost that forgotten child town of Mississauga. We almost and it hasn't. Listen, this is another funny story. I'll be honest. I was at an event in Mississauga in Malton, and I remember mayor saying, previous mayor saying, yeah, you know, I gotta leave now because I gotta go back to Mississauga, right, for whatever it was. And we're saying, mayor, you are in Mississauga, right? And so but we also enjoy this distinction of saying we're from Malton, right? I mean, I think from any town, in fact, because most people will say they're from Mississauga, whichever town within Mississauga they're in, except for people from Malton.
Absolutely, I agree
we predominantly will say we're from Malton because we're proud of it.
Well, a former historian that I worked with referred to Malton one time as the orphan stepchild of Mississauga.
right,
and proud of it.
And you know, if you ever come, yeah, so you know, Malton's through my eyes. I'll love to have that individual on our podcast, or if we do it next time, because I'll say, great, let me just share a few things. Just leave us alone. Don't use us as a thoroughfare. Don't travel through our airport. Oh, I can have a lot to be able to share with individuals if they want to kind of so-called diss on Malton, man. We'll make sure we hold ourselves account here. Right?
Absolutely, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, well, they might even gotten their vaccination over lately, you know, here just through us, right? And
I will say my second shot came in Malton. So
there you go. See, Matthew, I can catch so many people so many different ways, right? That if you even want to even take us down a notch, because I want us to be elevated to the top of the towns of Mississauga, right? Yep. And just reminding that everybody will still have a touch point with it, because if you feel like traveling after COVID now, there's a probability that you're going to take a flight out of Malton. I'm just saying. I was going to say,
I you know, thank you, Pardeep, for you know, executive director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, a proud Mississaugan, a proud Canadian, and just as proud of Malton.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So
Matthew, if you get, yeah.
So, go ahead. I was going to wrap up. Do you want anything else?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just, you know, thank you for spending time with us. It's been fascinating, and again, a tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there. We will share some links on how to connect to the Sikh Heritage Museum, and also to Pardeep's presentation with the museums of Mississauga some time ago. That's online as well. Just thank you, and for those tuning in, thank you for joining us here with Ask a Historian. Sending your questions each week, and continue to explore our local histories. And as we talked about today, continue to try to make those linkages, and they become fascinating stories or connections to the Canadian story, the Mississauga story, and yes, the Malton story. With that, like, subscribe, and follow us. Stay up to date on all the heritage happening with Heritage Mississauga, and we will see you on future episodes of Ask a Historian.